40k absolutely loves its clanking armoured death machines, and today we'll look at an exemplar. Let's see what the Sentinels of the Imperial Guard can do for us. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy and tactics focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of every miniature on the tabletop. Now, Sentinels are one of the old favourites of the Imperial Guard. They've been around for a very long time indeed, and it's rare for an experienced Guard commander not to have a few kicking about in their collection. They've very rarely been the top tier competitive pick over the ups and downs over the years, but they have somewhat acquired a new lease of life, with a few very powerful stratagems from the new Psychic Awakening book. In this video we'll take a look at the datasheet for Armoured and Scout Sentinels, any obvious ways that we can buff them or make them stronger on the table, and how I would run them myself on the tabletop. In the background, the Sentinel is a one-man light scout reconnaissance vehicle. Its bipedal legs and gyro stabilizers allowing it to traverse all sorts of terrain that might be far too uneven for the lumpen tanks of the Imperial Guard. They're primarily employed in scouting skirmish formations, though many regiments have chosen to up-armour their Sentinels, shrugging off light small arms fire as they wade into the thick of the battle. Sentinel pilots often have a reputation as being hotshot glory seekers, as it's quite rare in the Imperial Guard that one person gets sole command of a mighty war machine, particularly when they're expected to be a little bit more versatile and show initiative when they're operating independently, raiding enemy supply lines. So let's see what these rugged walkers can do on the tabletop with a look at the datasheets. Both Scout and Armoured Sentinels are fast attack choices for Codex Astra Militarum, and they have separate datasheets. Thanks to successive points drops in chapter approved, both variants are now 30 points, and they must take one heavy weapon as their primary armament. They can both be taken in squads between 1 and 3, and move together as a vehicle squadron on the tabletop. If we look at the Scout Sentinel's profile here, we have a movement of 9 inches, weapon skill and ballistic skill of 4+, strength and toughness 5, 6 wounds, 1 attack, leadership 7, and a 4-up save. At base they're equipped with multi-lasers. These are 5 points, putting them at 35 points a model, but you can swap them out for a number of different options, including the heavy flamer, autocannon, missile launcher, or las cannon. The autocannon and missile launcher are both pretty strong picks, providing a decent long-range punch for just 10 points extra, meaning that each Sentinel costs 40 points, and upgrading to the las cannon costs you an additional 5 points above this, meaning that they're 45 points per model. The heavy flamer will be 44 points for the Sentinel, but I do find that heavy flamers are quite short-ranged and really do limit you with how you play your models. Out of these picks, my favourites are the autocannon, missile launcher and las cannon, due to the multi-laser and heavy flamer just having fairly underwhelming damage for the points, although I could see the multi-laser being used if you're literally just trying to make the Sentinel as cheap as possible to fill out a brigade slot or something, as at 35 points they're the cheapest way for us to fill them. In addition to this, you can also take a Sentinel chainsaw for 2 points additional. This was just a little bit of extra kit that came with the Sentinel. That was just a decorative piece before, but in 8th edition they decided to make rules for it, which I thought was a fun, nice touch. Unfortunately though, they aren't very overwhelming in terms of close combat. They just increase your AP of your combat weapon by AP-1, and when you've only got 1 attack hitting on 4s, you're never really going to do much with it anyway. Sentinels just really don't want to be in close combat at the moment, so unfortunately it's really not worth the 2 points. Finally, each Sentinel can take a hunter-killer missile. This will cost you 6 points for a one-shot missile, firing with the same profile as a crack rocket. I'm usually not really the biggest fan of these when they're just on ballistic skill 4+ platforms. I don't really think they're the best return on your investment. However, there is a stratagem from the greater good that will give you +2 to your hit rolls, and in that case I'd most certainly think about including them. In terms of the special rules, the Scout Sentinel has the chance to explode, and on the roll of a 6, everyone within 3 inches suffers 1 mortal wound. It has the Scout Vehicle special rule, where at the start of the battle rounds but before the first turn begins, you can move your Scout Sentinels 9 inches, maybe to get them a better line of sight or to keep them safe, or to move up to contest a midfield objective. Now this special rule is the reason that you take Scout Sentinels over Armoured Sentinels, as otherwise the armoured variant is just kind of flatly better. Moving before the game is a powerful ability though. It could be used to help zone off some areas from deep strikers, and I think it's a good rule for nuisance type Sentinels that you're just keeping cheap with multi-lasers, where the main value that you're going to get from them is making them an annoying obstacle for your opponent to chew through, rather than any damage they'll actually be dealing. Finally, they also have smoke launchers, which are the standard affair of once per game for going your shooting, to be able to be -1 to hit next turn. If we look over at the Armoured Sentinel now, The two datasheets are nearly identical, but the Armoured Sentinel does have some perks. In terms of stat line differences, the Armoured Sentinel's movement is 8 rather than 9, which is a slight disadvantage, but 1 inch of movement is rarely going to make that much of a difference. Movement 8 is still quite good. It's the armour and defence of the Armoured Sentinel that is unsurprisingly the advantage. It goes up to toughness 6 over toughness 5, and goes up to a 3-up save over a 4-up save, which combine together to make it significantly harder to take out than the Scout Sentinel. The Scout Sentinel really has to fear things like crack grenades ruining its day, where the Armoured Sentinel is a lot more resilient to that type of attack. The Armoured Sentinel also has one additional option in terms of ranged wargear, in that it can take the plasma cannon instead of the other options. Now, plasma cannons are very cheap and effective firepower, but they do have a special downside on the Sentinels, in which that they can detonate your entire Sentinel if you happen to roll a 1 when you're overcharging, as you fire an average of 2 shots from your Armoured Sentinel. If you are overcharging and you don't have any source of re-rolling 1s, then you actually have an almost 1/3 chance of losing your Sentinel every single time you fire. To put it mildly, this is really not good. It basically means that I only ever consider using Armoured Sentinels if I'm using Cadian, or if I have a different source of re-rolling 1s, such as Commissar Yarrick or Sergeant Harker. Although, to be honest, the chance still definitely doesn't go down to 0. Even when you're exploding on 1s and re-rolling those 1s, every time you fire an overcharged plasma cannon, you still have around about a 5 or 6% chance of destroying your Sentinel in the process. So if you've got a lot of these firing over the course of the game, you are likely to do a significant amount of damage to your own units as well. It really is a bit of a shame because the plasma cannon is a very good value weapon for its points. It's almost as good as the las cannon against hard armoured targets, and better than the las cannon against toughness 7 armoured targets, and most heavy infantry, all for being 5 points cheaper. The plasma cannons do synergize quite well with that new stratagem from the Greater Good to give +2 to your hit rolls, as that will 100% prevent you from overheating your plasma cannons, at least on turn 1. Overall, I think both the Sentinels do have their merits. My general preference is for the armoured one, at least if I'm hoping to deal any real damage with them. They'd be my go-to choice for las cannons, missile launchers and autocannons, and of course plasma cannons. I'd be more tempted to take the Scout one if I was taking the multi-laser, and basically all I was hoping out of my Sentinel was to get in the way and gum up some midfield objectives, though again the extra durability of the armoured version could still make the Armoured Sentinel better for this. If you're putting heavy flamers on them, it could well be worth considering the Scout version as well, as that pre-game move can really get you closer, with a better chance to use that heavy flamer. So let's take a look at the different buffs and synergies that we can use to get the most out of Sentinels. First up, we have choice of regiment traits. Here, Cadian is pretty much your go-to for a damage dealing Sentinel that's happy to sit still. Re-rolling 1s is great, and overlapping fields of fire can be very useful, particularly if you're using plasma cannon Sentinels, as that is another source of keeping them safe from overheating. Kaschan could be somewhat helpful for a heavy flamer Sentinel or a plasma cannon one, allowing you to re-roll the number of shots. Talon's useful for keeping up Sentinel firepower while on the move, so it's quite good that you can exploit both a decent movement and justify spending some points on a heavy weapon, so you get both advantages. I found most of the rest a little bit less useful. Vostroin could help with a bit of extra range, though most of the guns are quite decent range already. I guess could potentially be useful with a big squad of plasma cannon Sentinels to use their +1 to hit stratagem, but you're likely going to have better things to buff with that. Mordian 5+ Overwatch isn't the worst, as the Sentinels are likely to be on the front line, but their Overwatch is honestly barely likely to deter anyone, as it's never going to be the strongest really. In terms of the new custom regiment traits, unfortunately the Sentinels don't get too much from this. Probably the single most useful is the jury-rigged repairs option, which essentially allows vehicles to regenerate lost wounds at the start of each of their turns. This isn't honestly the best on Sentinels though, as they have so few wounds they're quite likely to just be killed in one round of shooting, rather than leaving a Sentinel on half health, but every little helps. You could combine this with extra range, so you get regenerating vehicles plus essentially the Vostroin doctrine, where if you're using some flamery Sentinels, then gunnery experts plus reroll 1s for flamers for pyromaniacs is about the strongest you're ever going to make a heavy flamer in the guard. In terms of characters and synergy, the Sentinels don't have an awful lot going for them. In general they tend to be fairly independent operatives. As per normal you can give them reroll 1s with things like Sergeant Harrick or Harker, or get them to reroll all wound rolls against your chosen target with old grudges, but generally you are going to have more important units to buff with these things. Other than that, Tech Priest Engine Seers could certainly pile a few more wounds on a Sentinel, though again he's probably going to be best off fixing up your tank commanders or other big guns rather than chasing around the Sentinels. Next we come to stratagems, and this is one of the ways that Sentinels get more interesting. There aren't one, but there are 2 great Sentinel stratagems from the Greater Good. First up, we have the one that I mentioned earlier, which is called Strike First, Strike Hard. This targets a unit of Sentinels. I believe it can be either type, and it has to be used in the first battle round. This is a nice uncomplicated +2 to your hit rolls with the Sentinels, typically meaning they're usually going to be hitting on 2s. This is a really good value stratagem. It's very rare anywhere in 40k that you get a flat +2 to hit rolls for 1 command point, and that stratagem alone could really push you in favour of taking a big squad of Sentinels. It makes it very tempting just to take 3 Armoured Sentinels with 3 las cannons and 3 hunter-killer missiles, so you get 6 decent, powerful, armour-busting shots turn 1, all of which will be hitting on 2s, maybe even re-rolling 1s if you're Cadian or something. That initial Alpha Strike with 1 command point will put an average of 9 wounds on a typical toughness 7 vehicle, so they could get a large amount of their investment back straight from turn 1. It's really nice seeing as that's at 48-inch range too, meaning that you could be very flexible as to where you apply that firepower. A unit like this will cost 153 points, by the way. Of course, after that initial Alpha Strike has gone, the Sentinels will be significantly less potent in terms of their firepower, only having 3 las cannons to blaze away each turn. But even at this maximal loadout, they are really quite durable point for point. Those 3 Sentinels will have 18 toughness 6 3-up save wounds, which will be a bit of a pain for virtually any firepower to chew through. And if they weren't already durable enough, the next stratagem that they've got, which is called Deft Manoeuvring, another 1 command point stratagem that halves incoming damage on Armoured Sentinels. This could make an armoured line of Sentinels a real pain for your opponent to shift. They essentially just got Duty Eternal from the Space Marine Codex, and combined with an already great defensive profile, it means that if you decide you want an Armoured Sentinel squad to stick around for the turn, your opponent will have to invest an enormous amount of firepower to make that not happen. I'm not 100% sure how useful this one will be, as generally my main concern with Sentinels is more that they get ignored rather than being shot down, as your opponent almost always has something more juicy to shoot at in a guard army. But it's certainly a very powerful option and can push their durability absolutely through the roof. So 2 very powerful stratagems indeed there. Besides these ones from the Greater Good, from the main codex they also have Go Recon, which is a movement buff for your Scout Sentinels for 1 CP. It basically lets them move 2d6 inches in the shooting phase instead of shooting, so usually you're probably not going to want to bother with it. The main decision for me would be if it helps them get onto an objective or block a key movement line or something, then you could certainly think about it. Besides that, we also have Defensive Gunners, which could soup up the overwatch on a big Sentinel unit, Jury Rigging, which I generally wouldn't bother with on Sentinels, as they're about the lowest value vehicle wounds in the whole guard army, and Crush Them, which you could potentially use if it made the difference between killing 1 infantry model and probably not doing so, though with only 1 attack each that's certainly not guaranteed anyway. So in game you have a few choices with Sentinels, and the new Greater Good stratagems have certainly made it a little bit more complicated as to how you want to field them. Keeping them cheap, running them as minimum units for a brigade has been and always will be a good choice, though typically if it were me I'd probably make the small investment to get them an actual decent weapon over the multi-laser, either a missile launcher, autocannon or las cannon for me. The Psychic Awakening stratagems have made that unit more viable, with 3 Armoured Sentinels, las cannons and hunter-killer missiles, and it will be interesting to see if guard players do start to experiment with this. If you're running them as cheap distractions, I'd start them at a few different points along my battle line, ready to move up into the midfield, maybe contest or score some midfield objectives, and basically force your opponent to have to deal with them. I would beware slightly when using them in this format if your opponent has any big units, such as mobs of orcs or Tyranid termagants and things. They're sort of the ideal units that could get fully wrapped and enclosed in close combat so you can't fall back. This could make your big guns at the back very sad, as they're not able to target the big mob as it's in close combat with your Sentinel. So I generally think pushing up is a better idea against more elite armies, where that's less likely to be able to happen. If you are thinking about giving them heavy weapons, generally they're going to be wanting to stay still, so you'll just want to deploy them somewhere with decent line of sight in your deployment zone, where they have good range and line of sight with their las cannons, missile launchers, or plasma cannons or whatever. You can afford to be a lot more bold with their deployment than with your tanks, as generally if your opponent is baited into shooting the Sentinels, then it's kind of a win for you, as they're a lot more durable point for points than most of our other guard vehicles. Finally, if you're using the big squad of las cannons and hunter-killer missiles, if you're going first then you want to give them optimal line of sight and pop that stratagem. If you're going second, you could think about using either prepare positions or maybe even the deft manoeuvring stratagem if they do get focused, to preserve at least some of that alpha strike for your turn 1. Though again, if they do spook your opponent into shooting them more than your other armoured units, then it's probably for the best. As the game goes on, and maybe their firepower becomes a little bit less important, you could certainly think about moving them up towards objectives, particularly if some of your other squishier units get eliminated. With their firepower being mediocre even at best, sometimes it's just better having them as the solid armoured body where they need to be, rather than worrying too much if your missile launcher is hitting on 4s, for example. Overall, I think that Sentinels are never going to be the solid battle line unit of the Guard, and it's not really worth building an entire army around them, but they do have various niches where they can fulfill a very good tactical role, whether that's as minimum choices in a brigade for screening, some cheap extra armoured holes to put at the forefront of your army, or as that new big Sentinel squadron of death that the greater good has encouraged us to create. I'm glad to see them get some new and interesting options. Hopefully we'll see some more on the table. Thanks very much for listening to another Auspex Tactics video. If you'd like to hear more Guard content every couple of days, feel free to subscribe to the channel. We'll be delving into the Tempestus Scion Squad later, and maybe taking a bit more of a focused look at tank aces, so check back if you'd like to see that. If you'd like to support the channel, I do have a Patreon page. You'll find the link in the description below. If you're watching a lot of these videos and enjoying the content, any support is greatly appreciated, as they do take a very long time to make. There are also some other perks like early videos, some exclusive tournament reports, and voting on the future of the channel. So if any of that interests you, you'll find the link down in the description. Thanks very much for listening, I'll hope to see you guys next time.